So voila, this is what supposedly happens in the early 1800s. Joseph Smith Jr., who lived from 1805 to 1844, had several visions. We'll say more about the visions in due course, but I'm just giving you the sort of the version of the story you would get from the literature, from the pamphlets and things. In the spring of 1820, so he's 14, 15, 16 years old, depending on which version you read. Joseph Smith tells a story that he was very confused as a teenager because many of the churches in his area were having these revivals. So those of you who aren't familiar with the terminology, a revival is and these have been going on in American Christianity for more than a century, is where a local church would have a series of special meetings, more than just Sunday. They might have Sunday and then Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, or maybe even a whole week. And they'll usually bring in a special speaker who probably is gifted more towards the evangelism. And it's usually really high energy, and it's the thing you're encouraged to bring friends, especially lost friends or friends who are maybe had been Christians and then they've fallen away. And everyone just gets, quote, revived. And it just sort of reinvigorates the local church, and it gives you some momentum, and it propels you through the year, and then the next year you have revival. And for some local churches, it's a regular occurrence, and that's what they call it. When are we going to have our revival? Oh, our revival this year is going to be May, whatever. Now, not all churches do it, and they may have other names that they go by, but it's a very common thing in American Christianity. And I've had some great experiences. I'm sure we could spend the next week talking about testimonies a lot of us in this room have probably had from quote-unquote revival meetings in our Christian life, and I'm right there with you. Problem was, though, for Joseph Smith, is you've got all these revivals. So the Methodists are having their revival services, and the Baptists are having theirs, and the Presbyterians are having theirs, and the Assemblies of God, whoever. And that's confusing to him because it makes him wonder, okay, well, you got all these different churches, and they seemingly all have different interpretations of the Bible, and they all think the others are all wrong. So who's to say? So he sort of throws his hands up about, I don't know which denomination to associate with. So he's very confused about this. So in accordance, supposedly, with James 1:5, which says, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, he prays and asks which church to join. And so he has this vision of two personages, the Father and the Son, and one says, this is my beloved Son, hear ye him. All right? So they're going to help answer his prayer. He inquires as to which religion he should join, and by religion, and by the way, this goes even back to 18th century English. Most of the time, we don't use the word this way now, but in 18th century, and maybe even into 19th century English, the word religion more often was akin to our word denomination. So when the First Amendment said Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, they weren't thinking Buddhism and Islam and Christianity. They were thinking Protestant and Catholic or Baptist and Presbyterian. That's what their thinking was. It's clear from their collateral writings that that's what that word meant. I'm not suggesting that it shouldn't be expanded to mean something broader than just the Christian religion, but that's how he's asking that. He's not asking, should I be a Christian or a Buddhist? He's asking, should I be a Baptist or a Presbyterian? That's what the word is referring to, denomination. So what are the personages, which basically are the Father and the Son? Well, he says, don't join any of them. They're all wrong and corrupt. Okay? Now, newsflash. There isn't a whole lot of difference between Midway Community Church as a Baptist church and what you would have found as a Baptist church in late 19th century America. I'm saying theologically there's not a whole lot of difference. So by extension, if God is telling Joseph Smith that these churches are an abomination, that same commentary would apply to Midway today in the mind of a Mormon. Now I say that and I emphasize that because for the past several decades, the Mormon Church, and I don't blame them for this, but they've been on a concerted effort to really build a lot of bridges and smooth a lot of relationships out because they were pretty incendiary in a lot of their rhetoric against religious groups. We were abominations, and our our ministers were just chimpanzees, as far as their oafs and fools. These are the kind of imagery that you would encounter in the way they characterize it. Well, they don't really do that quite as readily, at least not publicly. They're trying to more or less build a PR campaign. And I don't blame them for doing that, except in my experience, I think it's dishonest. Because they really do think that about us. They really do think we're satanic. Okay? It isn't really we're all chummy here and we're all different denominations. They really believe that nobody in the world has anything godly about them except their group. They wouldn't use the word cult, so they wouldn't think we're a cult. I don't suppose they use that word, but they would probably prefer the word abomination. So they're going to, smooth it out a little bit. I'm not saying you're a cult. I'm just saying you're an abomination. That's all. So it's pretty unambiguous that they have that view of us, at least theologically. So he refrains from joining any of them and continued until further directed. So now he has another vision. Moroni, remember Moroni is the last prophet of the Book of Mormon, the son of Mormon, who's the one that buried the plates. He appears from the dead and told of a book written on golden plates. And so he shows Smith, over the course of time, he eventually shows him where these plates are buried, and he digs them up, and they're written in Reformed Egyptian, and so he has a certain mechanism whereby he's able to translate those, and that is now your Book of Mormon. So they're translated in 1829, and then the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was started in 1830. And again, it tells of these ancient civilizations who were basically the descendants of the Jews. All right? So, that's it in a nutshell. Now, this is intended to be a sort of a standalone thing that I had done on other occasions. But I take the challenge of Orson Pratt. He's like, convince us of our errors. By sound reason from the Bible or whatever. Okay, let's see if I can convince you of your errors. And I want to try to give you my arguments as to why Joseph Smith is not a prophet. And you may wonder, well, why would that matter? Well, look at what is said about the significance of Joseph Smith in this whole stream of events, how essential he is to Mormonism. In fact, I would allege that the whole rest of everything that Mormonism is stands or falls with Joseph Smith. Brigham Young said, every intelligent person under the heaven that does not, when informed, acknowledge that Joseph Smith Jr. is a prophet of God is in darkness and is opposed to us and to Jesus and His kingdom on earth. This Journal of Discourses is a multi-volume set of early Mormon preaching, including a lot of Brigham Young. It's not authoritative. It's not one of the standard works of the church, and it's possible to find things in the Journal of Discourses that was preached by Mormon leaders that isn't necessarily consistent with church doctrine. But, so it's not a gotcha moment. You're not going to get anywhere with a Mormon to say, well, the Journal of Discourses say this. Well, too bad for the Journal of Discourse. It's just a bunch of sermons the guy preached. They weren't prophets necessarily. These are just church leaders or whatever, but they're not infallible. I mean, so it isn't a good way to try to hold them over a barrel like they've got to cry uncle because Brigham Young said something sort of off the cuff in the Journal of Discourses. It's not really going to carry a lot of weight with them. Maybe it should, but be that as it may, it just doesn't. Bruce McConkie, you've met several times. Since the keys of salvation were restored to the prophet, that is Joseph Smith, it is in and through and because of his latter-day mission that the full redemptive power of the Lord has again become available to men. That's out of his book, Mormon Doctrine. Joseph Fielding Smith, 10th president of the church. Mormonism, as it is called, must stand or fall in the story of Joseph Smith. He was either a prophet of God, divinely called, properly appointed, and commissioned, or he was one of the biggest frauds this world has ever seen. There is no middle ground. If Joseph Smith was a deceiver who willfully attempted to mislead the people, then he should be exposed, his claims should be refuted, and his doctrines shown to be false. For the doctrines of an impostor cannot be made to harmonize in all particulars with divine truth. If his claims and declarations were built on fraud and deceit, there would appear many errors and contradictions which would be easy to detect. The doctrines of false teachers will not stand the test when tried by the accepted standards of measurement, the Scriptures. Okay? Let's see if we can see how they do stand up. Now, we just did this, so I don't need to spend too much time on some of the details, but I don't want to miss any of the slides because of some collateral observations can be made. But the first vision is really integral. If you could show that there was something illicit about that experience, then I think the foundations begin to crumble. However, I think the argument is actually stronger than just that. So even if one is not satisfied with the criticisms we can level against the vision, I think Joseph Smith's credentials as a prophet are still going to be found wanting. John Widstow, Quorum of the 12 Apostles, says the first vision of 1820 is of first importance in the history of Joseph Smith. Upon its reality rests the truth and value of his subsequent work. McConkie again says, with this vision came the call of that prophet who, save Jesus only, was destined to do more for the salvation of men in this world than any other man that has ever lived. McConkie's quoting Doctrine and Covenants 135:3 there. Richard Winwood, in his book, Take Heed That Ye Be Not Deceived, what this book is a sort of Mormon response dealing with, quote, anti-Mormon literature. So he tries to answer the objections that are leveled. He says this, Joseph Smith's first vision in 1820, wherein he beheld God the Father and Jesus Christ, is one of the most significant religious events in the history of the world. This glorious vision restored the fullness of the gospel to the earth and established a new prophet to lead God's children out of darkness. Since this pivotal event is so central to the restored gospel, it is no wonder that the anti-Mormons would target Joseph's different descriptions of this experience and look for reasons to discredit or cast out. Now, you can already begin to see, perhaps, where the criticism is going to go, because he's already acknowledging that there are apparently, quote, different descriptions of the experience. Gordon Hinckley says, we declare without equivocation that God the Father and His Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, appeared in person to the boy Joseph Smith. When I was interviewed by Mike Wallace on the 60 Minutes program, he asked me if I actually believe that. I replied, yes, sir. That's the miracle of it. That is the way I feel about it. Our whole strength rests on the validity of that vision. It has either occurred or it did not occur. If it did not, then this work is a fraud. If it did, then it is the most important and wonderful work under heavens. All right, so what are the arguments? How do we know, how are we supposed to know this is true? Let me summarize for you at least a handful of arguments that Mormons will give for how they know that the Book of Mormon is authentic. And this bears repeating. So I'll say this probably again next week. But in effect, here's what to look for. The Book of Mormon is purportedly a book that, as you heard the story, that was translated by Joseph Smith. So the argument is, whoever God used to bring this book back to light, and through His power enabled him to do that translation, whoever that person is, that person must be a prophet. So because of what we know about the Book of Mormon, we know then that Joseph Smith must be the prophet that he is because of what we know about this book. Now, because we know Joseph Smith is the prophet that he is, then the other things that Joseph Smith goes on to write, purportedly through the power of God, his visions like in the Doctrine and Covenants and other translations like in the Pearl of Great Price, we know those are also from God because they're written by the prophet of God. And we know he's the prophet of God because of the testimony that we're going to see that comes from this book. So do you see how the argument goes? So if we can know this book is authentic in so many ways, we can know that the person through whom it came by the power of God is, quote, authentic. So what are some of those arguments? Well, here are some of them. Mormons claim that Joseph Smith lacked the education and access to information to be able to fabricate a work of the caliber of the Book of Mormon. They challenge anyone to duplicate the work Joseph Smith Jr. did in writing the Book of Mormon in order to demonstrate that no one who lacks the education and access to information he did would be able to fabricate it. So in fact, I have a pamphlet up here. It's called The Challenge. And it just says, look, here are, I guess it's 30 constraints. If you can succumb to these 30 constraints and come up with something comparable to the Book of Mormon, in effect they're saying, I defy anybody to do that. So the argument is, he couldn't have done this of his own resources. He didn't have the means. He was uneducated in many ways. He didn't have access to the information that the book is comprised of. So the only way he could have done it was supernaturally. That's sort of the way the argument goes. But he produces the Book of Mormon, therefore the Book of Mormon was not fabricated. That's pretty straightforward. Thus Joseph Smith Jr. must have done this by the power of God. Anyone who does such work by the power of God is a prophet. Therefore Joseph Smith is a prophet. That's the way the argument goes. All right. Second, I'm just getting these out on the table, and then we'll revisit them the balance of tonight and then next week. Mormons argue that the Book of Mormon was predicted by the Bible. The one through whom God brought the Book of Mormon to light must be a prophet. Since this one is Joseph Smith Jr., then he's a prophet of God. Third, Mormons argue that no evidence, such as archaeological or historical, exists against the Book of Mormon. Thus, no evidence against Joseph Smith being a prophet of God based on an argument against the Book of Mormon is sound. In other words, there's no countervailing evidence to show that it's false. So any argument based on the fact that this is countervailing evidence shows it's false is a failed argument because there isn't any. Fourth, the most important argument, and I deliberately put that in scare quotes, as they're known in literature. When you see a word in quotations and it's evidently not a quote, it's known in writing as a scare quote. That means the writer's trying to flag the reader that he's using a word in an unusual kind of way. As you'll see why I put that in quotations as I do. The most important, quote, argument that Mormons offer to prove that Joseph Smith Jr. is a prophet of God. This seems the most important to me. If a Mormon wants to quarrel with me, well, that's not our most important. Okay, it seemed like it to me. And you'll see why it seems like it, and it'll probably seem like it to you. Is really what I would label a subjective test. That may be a little tendentious to say it that way, but you be the judge of whether that's a fair characterization. But here's basically how it goes. No matter what objective evidence, that is public evidence, is brought against the authenticity of the Book of Mormon addressed in the above arguments, this subjective test always overrides it. And I'm saying it always overrides it in every Mormon I've ever talked to over the past 30 years of study in Mormonism. So perhaps someone may want to say, well, your experiences were not typical. Okay. But that's all I can go by. It's just all the ones I've talked to and all the literature that I've read. Thus, ultimately, Mormons feel no obligation to try to answer the evidence against Joseph Smith, Jr., the Book of Mormon, and other scriptures in Mormonism. Here's what the test is. One is to read the Book of Mormon and pray and ask God to show him if the Book of Mormon is true and is from God. That's a promise out of Moroni chapter 10, verse 4, and then we made the reference earlier to James 1:5. They think that's a corroborating verse. So, if God will show the one praying that the Book of Mormon is true by an inner testimony or feelings. Galatians 5:22 and following, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, these kind of things. So, they say, look, we could argue all day long, but all I'm asking you is, look, just take it and you just read it and ask God. That's all I'm asking you to do. You just ask God. He'll show you whether it's true or not. Once one knows, quote unquote, that the Book of Mormon is true and is from God, then one can conclude that Joseph Smith, who was given the Book of Mormon and translated it, is a prophet of God. This is why I said this bears repeating, because I've already said this once, now I'm saying it again. It'll probably come up again. Once you know the Book of Mormon is true, because you read it and asked God to show you, and He showed you, and now I know that it's true, then I know that the person through whom it came must be the prophet. Therefore, I know Joseph Smith is a prophet by inference from what I know about the Book of Mormon. Once one accepts Joseph Smith as a prophet of God, then the other writings of Joseph Smith, namely his revelations contained in the Doctrine and Covenants and his translation of the Pearl of Great Price, can also be known to be true and from God. Right. Clear as mud? That's how you get it. You're supposed to read it and just ask. And we'll have something to say about that here again when the time comes.